Thank you so much. It always impresses me when people applaud before they hear me. I admire your faith. I hope that it has not been a forlorn applause. You can take it back at the end if you wish. So here we are, our final time with you at New Life. On behalf of Judy and myself, thank you so much for the privilege of being here, not just teaching, but sharing life with you. You do us a power of good. You might not realize that, but you do. And we love being with Pastors Chris and Lisa, but also getting to know some of you as well. I never have to worry about where Judy is if I'm somewhere, because I know somebody will have grabbed her and encapsulated her in your warmth and tender care. So thank you for that. I was saying to somebody, we're going to the Victoria Falls tomorrow as a little bonus for us, and if I go on my own, I know that you'll be looking after Judy, but I suspect she'll want to be coming with me. So we've enjoyed our time together. I certainly have. And by the way, in the news we just heard then the newscaster asking the question, does God speak today? And the answer is, she gave it, yes, he does. And in the next 25, 30 minutes, you will hear me talking, but you will also hear God talking, because God knows you better than me, and he will drop a thought into your mind or stir your emotions. So I'm telling you that in advance, so not to be surprised by it, because although I am interested in your development as Christians, he is much more interested in your development in your lives, whether you are a follower of Jesus or an interested person who's thinking about it. He's very keenly interested in your journey. So don't be surprised if your emotions are touched in these next 30 minutes, because it's not me, it'll be him still talking. Well, in the past 4 weeks, if you've been with me, you will remember that we've been focusing in the Gospel of John and asking the author a couple of questions. We've asked him, talk to us about the Father, talk to us about Jesus, talk to us about the Holy Spirit. And this week, I want to ask you, John, what have you got to say to us as your readers of your Gospel? What can you say to us in the 21st century, even though you wrote in the 1st century? And it's a very important message that he has to offer for you and also for me. Now, I don't know whether you've had a tough morning or whether you can remember in the recent days a tough morning. Well, if you can, then you will sympathize with Jesus, because the story that I'm going to tell you is embedded in a tough morning for Jesus. He's been teaching, he's been in the capital, he's been in the temple, so you would anticipate that he's going to get a warm response from those people who will value his presence with them and his teaching. But unfortunately, even though it's just after breakfast, the response of the people to whom he's teaching is to want to kill him. And they have decided how they're going to kill him. They're going to stone him to death. And in the ancient world, the practice of stoning is carefully prescribed. The person who is to be stoned is laid on the floor face down, and a rock is lifted to be about 4 meters above them and is dropped. The assumption is that the back will be broken and death will soon follow. But if for some reason it doesn't happen, then the person is flipped over onto their back, and the same procedure happens with a rock being dropped from the same height, but this time onto the heart of the person. And if the person still lives, then a volley of stones are hurled at the victim until he or she is dead. If I was Jesus, I wouldn't want to be there. Time for an escape, time for a safe house, time to get away. But interestingly, Jesus does not choose to get away. It would be my priority, but it is not his priority, because, of course, he's Jesus, and sometimes other priorities will come to the fore. And on this occasion, there is one item on his agenda that supersedes the need for him to escape the mob. You see, he sees a blind man. Now, Jesus could be forgiven for walking past this blind man, because the blind man clearly can't see him. The blind man doesn't request any help from him, and indeed nobody intervenes on behalf of the blind man and asks Jesus for any help. So if I was Jesus, I would have walked by. And if Jesus had wanted to help this blind man, because clearly he has all power, then he could have come back on another occasion when things had quietened down a bit. But he doesn't. His focus is not on his own personal safety, but on this blind man. The question is, why? Well, because you know Jesus, you may anticipate that you know the answer. He is wanting to heal this man of his blindness, and you would be right in your assessment. That is what he is going to do, but that is not the main reason why Jesus does not run away and instead turns to this blind man. You see, the real reason is because his attention is not just to this man, not just to his need to be healed, but he plans through this event to make a statement that is going to be beneficial to everybody who is there and to everybody who hears this story, which John uniquely tells in his gospel. This is more than a wonderful story of healing. So let's read the story. It's taken from John chapter 9, and I'm just going to read the first part of this story to you so we can get the context for the message. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents because he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It wasn't that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We," says Jesus, "must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work, but as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spat on the ground, and he made mud with the saliva. And then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went, and he washed, and he came back seeing. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" So who is he, this blind man? He's not named. All we know is that he is a blind man. It is not a comprehensive description of this person. But having said that, because we know that he is a blind man, his status is clearly characterized so that we understand that his position in society is to be towards the bottom. He is on the lower echelons of the Jewish community. How do I know that? He's blind. You see, being blind in the first century was not just a devastating disease that affected many, but it made a statement to everybody around you, especially in the Jewish environment. You see, the rabbis, the Jewish religious leaders, they concluded that to be a blind man was only slightly better than being dead. And the reason they said that was because there is no hope for you. You cannot be healed of your blindness. There is no therapy that is available to even slightly improve your condition. In fact, they actually said that it is as difficult to heal a blind person as it is to raise somebody from the dead. To be blind in the ancient world was an awful experience. In the Old Testament, God had healed certain people of certain illnesses, but never once did any Jewish prophet heal anybody of blindness. There was no precedent for anybody being healed of blindness in the Jewish world. Not even God had healed any Jewish person of blindness. This man, this blind man, was not expecting a miracle. The disciples were not expecting a miracle. The people around were not anticipating that there was any reason why they should bring this man to Jesus for Jesus to heal him, because he was too big an ask. Nobody had done that before. It was too difficult. But there's something else about blind people that we need to understand so that we can position ourselves in the place of this man. You see, being blind in the ancient world meant that you were helpless. You weren't just hopeless, but you were helpless and you were dependent on others. Now, this is a society where shame and honor are most significant elements in the worldview of the time. And this man, being blind, is in the most dishonorable state because he cannot contribute anything to his society. Blind people were on their own. This man is on his own. Nobody brings this man to Jesus. Nobody is on the side of this man. In fact, in the ancient Jewish world, it's very difficult to bless a blind person because it looks as if God has cursed him. So how can you help someone to whom God has shown disdain and a determination to punish? Blindness, the ultimate disaster, a fate akin to living dead. All he can aspire to is to be a beggar. But then there's one more thing about being a blind person, and I've already hinted at it, and you will have heard me saying the same about other people with illness in the first century. To be ill in the first century meant you assumed that you had done something wrong, as a result of which God has chastised you. He has punished you because you must have sinned. And the easiest way to identify that you must have sinned is because of the illness that you carry. Now, blindness was understood to be at the top of conditions that resulted from severe sin. So the people assume that this man is not just helpless, hopeless, but God has punished him because he has done something heinous in its extremity. That's their assumption. And even the disciples, there is no confusion in the minds of the disciples as to why this man is blind. He sinned. They readily acknowledge that, even though it's not true. Their confusion arises from the fact that he is born blind. Now, John, in the telling of the story, says that this man is born blind 6 times. It's as if he doesn't want the pathos of that fact to miss us. He's not just blind, he's born blind. The severity of his blindness is extreme. And the disciples say, because he's born blind, Jesus, who must have sinned? Did he sin before he was born in his mother's womb? Or was it his parents? They conclude that some sin must have caused the illness. Jesus' response is, listen, no sin has caused this illness at all. But to him and to everybody else, he must have sinned. That's why in the Jewish world, if you were blind, you can't serve in a religious establishment. You can't serve in the temple. You can't serve in any spiritual sanctuary. You certainly cannot be a priest because you were blind. Even blind animals were not allowed to be sacrificed in the temple for one's forgiveness. Blindness was listed as the first in a list of ailments that would have barred you from being a priest. Some Jewish leaders, some Jewish religious leaders said that blind people shouldn't be even allowed into the city of Jerusalem because they will contaminate this place with the contamination that permeates their being as a result of the sin that must have resulted in this blindness that they have. You see, there was something deeply marginalizing about being a blind person in the Jewish world. And it appeared that even God was uncomfortable about being with blind people. No wonder he doesn't ask Jesus for any help. Why should he? How could he? Why would Jesus respond with anything positive when it had never happened before? But Jesus does. And I want to pause and ask the question, what are we learning about Jesus from that fact? And the one thing that we can learn is that Jesus doesn't have to be asked before he does something for us that's good. He doesn't have to be asked before he will infuse into our lives something beneficial. He is not dependent on our request before he decides to act on our behalf. And the fact is that sometimes, and maybe today, you are feeling that you are not overly dissimilar to that blind man. You are not too sure that there's any point in asking Jesus for help because you are not sure whether you are worthy of his response, any response, let alone a good response. You're nervous that he's too worthy for you. Well, he is, and he's too worthy for me. But the fact is that he is more desirous of doing good for us than we can imagine. And sometimes he will respond to our requests when we ask him, but sometimes because he is who he is, he will give to us something that is good because that's who he is. He's a good Jesus. And this blind man does not ask for help from Jesus, and he wouldn't dream of asking for help, because why would Jesus help him? He doesn't deserve it, and nobody has been healed of blindness before, but Jesus heals him. But why does he do it in such a funny way? You read it with me when I was presenting the story to you as John tells it. Jesus takes some spittle, and he takes some earth, and he mixes them together. I imagine that means there's a fair bit of spittle here. This is quite a gory exercise. Mixes the mud together until there's a substantial amount of mud. And then he calls the blind man. He says, come a little closer. I wonder what the blind man was expecting. Maybe a little bit of money. Maybe a nice touch, maybe a hug. He wasn't expecting to be healed, but maybe something. And all he feels is this cold, clammy mud being daubed on his eyes. It's in his cheeks, and very soon it's going to be caked a little harder in the brightness of the Israeli sun. Why'd you do that, Jesus? Oh, I've got a bit more to do. I want you now, blind man who's now doubly blind, I want you to go to the pool of Siloam, which is south of Jerusalem, south of the temple, and I want you to wash it off. Jesus, that's about a mile. Well, I want you to do it. And I can't help but ask Jesus, why? Why are you doing that? Why are you putting this earth and spittle on his face? Why are you telling him to walk for a mile to a pool and wash it off? Is that the way that you're going to heal blind people from now on? He's not done it before. He's not done it afterwards. I don't see any other occasion in the New Testament where we are encouraged to do this to anybody who is ill, let alone being blind. Jesus, why are you doing it? Because if you wanted to heal him, I know you could do it like that. You definitely don't need him to ask you to heal him. He doesn't need to express any faith in you, because you can just heal because you can, because I know who you are. So why don't you do it on this occasion? And if Jesus was sitting here, I think he would say, Keith, you're missing the point of the story. You've got caught up with the healing. You've got caught up with the severity of the blindness. You've indulged too much time speculating why I did this business with the earth and the spittle and told him to go to the pool. This is not a story about healing. Oh yes, he gets healed. That is not the reason why this story is told by John. It is not the reason why the man is healed, because there are lessons in this event that are for you and for me. And we weren't there. We weren't alive. But Jesus thinks comprehensively. So let me prove my case when I'm saying that this is more than a story about healing. Healing certainly occurs, but it's more than that. Number one, the man clearly needs to be healed. I know that Jesus could do it. Even though he hasn't healed blindness before, I know he could do it because I know who he is. Jesus doesn't immediately heal him, but instead, he takes his time. He pauses. He slows down. I don't know how long it took for the earth and the spittle to be mashed together, but it must have been minutes. I don't know how long it took for Jesus to daintily put the clay on the man's face. I don't know how long it took for the man to realize what was happening. I don't know how long it took for him to walk to the pool of Siloam and then to walk back, but time it certainly took. And all the while, the people who are there are watching and waiting and wondering why. And the man who can't even see what Jesus is doing until it happens, he's just waiting and wondering, why not just heal him, Jesus? Keith, this is more than a story about healing. And then he tells him to go to the pool of Siloam. Stop wasting your time, Jesus. Stop wasting his time. Just heal him. There's something more important at stake here than mere healing. And it becomes obvious when we look at the words that Jesus says. So he's done his actions. What is the first thing that he says? I'll remind you. He says to the man, the blind man, the doubly blind man, he couldn't see before, now he definitely can't see. He says to this man, I want you to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And then John helpfully tells us that the word Siloam means sent. There's a message here. Let's not fail to pick it up. Jesus sends this man to the place where sent people are sent. This is about obedience, not just about healing. You see, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 8, verse 6, the Jewish people are given the opportunity to obey God. He asks them to do something, and would you believe it? It is at the pool of Siloam. Same place. But on that occasion, the Jewish people reject the commission that God gives to them. And the question is, what will the blind man do? Well, we've read the story. We know what he will do. It's very interesting that despite what Jesus has done for him, daubed his face, he obeys Jesus. And John mentions that fact twice. It's as if he doesn't want to miss the point that although the man will be healed, we as the readers need to recognize that what is central to the story is that the man obeys Jesus. He obeys Jesus even though Jesus has made him doubly blind. He obeys Jesus and he goes to the pool of Siloam and he obeys immediately. No hesitation, no apparent expectation that anything is going to happen to him other than that the clay is going to be washed from his face. He has no expectation that anything else is going to happen. He just obeys. And that's the first point and the main point about this story. This is a story about obedience. And attached to that feature, John's going to tag on a couple of issues. Number one, obedience is good for us. Obedience is not necessarily associated with discipline or hardship or pain or suffering. As far as Jesus is concerned, when we obey him, there is often something beneficial that will result from that. In other words, we should obey because we are followers of Jesus if we're Christians, but Jesus being Jesus would like to give us something when we do that which we should be doing anyway. And this blind man obeys Jesus. He doesn't know what's coming. Jesus does. I can't help but imagine that when Jesus sees this man stumbling away to the pool of Siloam, there must have been a smile on his face because he realizes this man has done exactly what I hoped he would do. The healing is a bonus. What he has done, he's obeyed me. That's what I hoped he was going to do. That's what he has done. And the shock to the blind man is that when he rubs the clay off, he can see for the first time in his life. Obedience to Jesus is what's important to this story. It's more important than the machinations of Jesus creating clay out of earth and spittle. It's more important than the severity of the blindness of this man. It's even more important than the healing that Jesus achieves for this man. This is all about obedience. Jesus sent him and he obeyed. Funnily enough, just before this story, Jesus identifies himself as one whom God has sent. God sent Jesus. Jesus acknowledges that, and he obeyed the will of the Father. And now Jesus is giving this blind man the opportunity to follow in his footsteps and to be a sent person who obeys the commission. And he passes his first test of obedience as a would-be disciple of Jesus. He's recognized who Jesus is, and he is to be obeyed. A little while ago, we sang the song, Holy Spirit, have your way. Jesus, have your way in our lives. And if you are a follower of Jesus, that is your enthusiastic desire. Please impress yourself upon my life, Jesus. We want your will to be invoked in our journeys. But there, of course, is a response from us. Because he will not just take us and robotically change us into his likeness. Our response is to do what the blind man did. We obey the commissions that Jesus gives to us. And he has individual commissions. Some of them are quite small. Some of them are substantial. Some of them you've been wrestling with for a little while in your life because they're difficult to put into action. Some of them are aspects of your personality and character you know need to be changed, and you've sensed that Jesus is nudging you to try and change them. And the way to do it is not to say, please will you do it for me, but to say, I'm going to try. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to do my level best to obey you, Jesus. Please come and help me. But I am taking the initiative in this, just like this blind man did. Well, let's move a little further, because fundamental to this obedience of this blind man is another question that I have, which is this: why should we obey Jesus? Why should we obey Jesus? And John, in telling this story, is quite clear that there is a fundamentally important reason why we should obey Jesus. It's this: he has supreme authority. He has superlative authority. He is peerless. There is nobody who is above him. That fundamentally is the reason why I should obey Jesus, because he deserves my respect. He merits my obedience. And so John puts that into the story. Let me trace it through with you. You'll remember at the start of the story that Jesus meets this blind man at the temple. Why does he tell me that innocuous piece of information? Does it matter where he was? Well, yes, it does. You see, the temple to the Jewish people was viewed as the place where God's presence was. That was their assumption. And if God's presence is there, then all power is available. But unfortunately, this man has been blind from birth, and there has been no improvement in his condition despite the fact that he is next to the temple. You see, proximity to the temple matters not a scrap. It's proximity to Jesus that matters. And there's the first subliminal message that John is offering us. Jesus' authority is greater than the authority of the temple. But then he moves us a little further, and he squeezes in a little piece of information that we might have missed. This healing took place on the Sabbath, the Saturday. Who cares? Well, you see, on the Sabbath, there are certain things that you as a Jew can do and certain things that you as a Jew can't do, and you need to keep the Sabbath rules. So what does Jesus do? Well, he breaks them. He mixes earth with spittle, and he makes clay, and according to the Jewish legislation, not God's laws, but according to the Jewish legislation, that means he's working. And the Pharisees later in the story accuse Jesus of being a Sabbath breaker. Sabbath breaker? What's he done? Well, I'll tell you for one thing, he's been fiddling around with earth and spittle, and that's work. He's broken the Sabbath. The message from John: Jesus has greater authority than the Sabbath, and he will prove it in a little while. But before we get there, Jesus does something else. He actually implicates this blind man in that he also breaks the Sabbath, because Jesus instructs him to go to the pool of Siloam, which, as I've said, is about a mile away, and that means that he has broken Sabbath legislation, because you're only supposed to travel so far on the Sabbath, and he has broken it. Jesus, who do you think you are? The response from Jesus is, well, who do you think I am? Question is, do I have authority over the Sabbath? Do I have authority over the temple? And the proof of it is that he heals the man. He heals the man of blindness, and nobody has ever done that before. In Jewish history, not the greatest of prophets like Elijah and Elisha or Moses, not even the father of the faith, Abraham, has ever been able to do this, but Jesus does it. God has never done it before in the Old Testament, but Jesus does it. He is a superlative being in terms of his authority. Do you notice what Jesus says about himself just before the man is healed? He says, I am the light of the world. I have the ability to give light to everybody. And then he manifests it. He gives an object lesson in that he gives light to one man. But it's as if to prove the point that he has the ability to give light and life to everybody in the world. Now, the context to the Jewish person is this: that in the book of Isaiah, God, Jehovah, is defined as being the light of the Jews, the light of Israel, the light of the Jewish people. And Jesus says, my authority, he's not saying that he's better than God, but he's saying my authority is not just to give light to a particular people group. I have the ability to give light to everybody. That is the level of my authority. The authority of Jesus is invested in that which has happened before the healing and in the healing. But John says, I've got a bit more I want to tell you, so that you get the full-orbed, comprehensive presentation of just how authoritative Jesus is, because this is the one who calls you to follow him. Not because you should do it slavishly, because otherwise he'll zap you and you will be a nothing. On the contrary, this is an unbelievable privilege. The one who has this comprehensive authority says, would you like to follow me? We should be racing ahead of everybody else to be the first to follow him, because he is so powerful. But John hasn't finished, so I need to pull back to the story. You see, this story, which we only read the first 8 verses, but the story actually goes on for 37 verses. So the first 7 verses, the man gets healed. The next 30 verses, we are introduced to a conversation between Jesus and the religious leaders. The blind man and the religious leaders. And the religious leaders can't understand what's happened to this blind man, and they quiz him. And then eventually they reject him. And then we're introduced to a conversation between the blind man and Jesus. And embedded within those sets of conversations, the authority of Jesus is heightened in our understanding. So let's be the blind man and see how we work from a low base of assumption as to who Jesus is to a very high level of assumption. So here's how the story starts. You will know he doesn't know who Jesus is. He doesn't ask for healing. He goes and he gets healed and he's shocked to bits and he comes back. And they say, are you that guy that used to beg? And he says, yes, I am. And some say, no, you're not, because you were blind. And he says, no, I am. And others say, well, you don't have to look like him, but I can't believe that you're the same person because you can see. So how? Tell me, how did it happen? Here's his response. A man called Jesus did it. That's the low level of his appreciation as to who Jesus is. He's a man, another Jew, happens to be called Jesus, and he told me to do this, and I did. He recognizes that Jesus is worthy of his obedience, and John tells me that fact 3 times. Obedience is central to this story. Where is he? The people say, I don't know. I haven't got a clue where he is. Don't even know what he looks like. Now, that from that low base, of an appreciation of who Jesus is, he begins to ascend upwardly to a high recognition of who Jesus is. So let's follow that journey upwards. The people quiz him, the religious leaders quiz him, and they say, well, who is this? And he responds by saying, first of all, well, he's a man called Jesus. Then he identifies Jesus as his healer. He says that twice. And then he identifies Jesus as a prophet and as somebody who is worthy of being followed. And then he says, Jesus has uniquely healed me of blindness. Then he says that Jesus is someone to whom God listens. God, says this blind man who has no education, no knowledge of Jesus, he has come to the conclusion, he's beginning to work it out, and he says, do you know, I think God listens to him. You cheeky monkey, who do you think you are, say the religious leaders. God doesn't listen to him at all. God listens to us. We'll tell you who Jesus is. He's a Sabbath breaker. He breaks the Sabbath, and he's a sinner. That's who he is. And they keep quizzing him. And then the blind man, in some measure of consternation, comes to a light bulb moment and says, oh, I understand now why you were keeping asking me questions about Jesus. I understand it. You want to be his followers, don't you? You haven't liked to say it, but I've seen through it. You are wanting to be his followers, and you are intrigued by him, and you keep asking me questions as to who he is, because the more I talk about him, the more I realize he's not just any old Jew. It wasn't just a mere coincidence that this magician came along. No. He was the unique healer of my blindness. He is a prophet of God. God listens to him. Their outrage is intense, and they throw him out. They reject him. And it's at that point that Jesus finds him. It's very interesting, this notion of Jesus finding people in the Gospel of John. Jesus found Philip and asked him to follow him. He found the paralyzed man who had been healed, and he gave him new life. He found Lazarus and raised him from the dead. And now, having been cast out by the establishment, Jesus finds this blind man and gives him the opportunity not just to have a relationship with himself as a healer, but to have a relationship with himself as somebody who is peerless in his authority. Those of you who are followers of Jesus, those of you who are Christians, you have been found. You have been found by Jesus, even when you didn't know you were lost. And if you did know you were lost, you didn't know how to get anybody to find you, Jesus was ahead of the game, and he found you. That means that you are never on your own. Because when Jesus finds you, he doesn't find you for a moment. He doesn't just keep you for a couple of days. He finds you and retains you within his grip. Now, for some of you, you would love the idea of being found by anybody, let alone Jesus, but you're not too sure whether he wants to find you. Let me tell you that if you have come to this place today, and maybe it's your first time, and you're wondering all about that which I'm saying and the sense of belief that the people have around you in what they're singing and so forth, trust me, Jesus is looking to find you, and your response is to say, here I am, and allow his desire to find you to be realized in a relationship with him, because that's what happened to the blind man. You see, when this blind man was found by Jesus, Jesus said to him, and the blind man doesn't yet know that the one who's talking to him is the one who healed him. He doesn't know. And Jesus says, so, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now, the Son of Man is a Jewish term, which is another way of describing Messiah, which is the anointed person that the Jews then and now are looking forward to coming to set up a new reign of God in the earth. So Jesus says, do you believe in this Son of Man, this Messiah? And the man says, yes, I do. Where is he? And Jesus says, you're talking to him. And he accepts the fact that Jesus is now not just a healer or a prophet, but he's also Messiah. But his response tells me that he's appreciating that Jesus is even more than that, because he falls on his face and he worships Jesus. You don't worship Messiah, because Messiah isn't God, according to the Jewish people. There's only one person you worship, and that is God. And that is where this man has achieved the climax of his perception as to who Jesus is. He knows that the one whom he obeyed some hours ago was a lot more worthy of his obedience than he ever realized. He actually obeyed God when Jesus says, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. That's the one that we are called to obey. He is worthy of our obedience. He deserves our service. He merits our respect. He demands our commitment because of who he is. And then on the end of it, he tags a little bonus and said, if you do, I'm going to do something good for you anyway. It's not a carrot, because we should be obeying him for who he is, but he likes to do us good. But there's one final point I want to mention, and it still relates to this issue about obedience, and it's this. When Jesus is making the earth and the spittle, he says a couple of things. He says he's the light of the world, and then he manifests it in the healing of this man. But he also says these words, we must do the works of him who sent us. We must do the works of him who sent us. We must do that which God has asked us to do. We must do it. Who's the we that Jesus is referring to? I understand that Jesus must do that which God has asked him to do, but Jesus says, no, we must do it together. Well, Jesus, who are you referring to? Surely, to goodness, you can't be referring to the blind man, because the blind man has done nothing to help you achieve your ambitions. Well, I say he's done nothing. He's done something to give him some credit. He's obeyed you, but that's it. You've done the rest. And that's the point. It's not just all he's done. It's all that he needs to do in order for he and Jesus together to partner to ensure that Jesus achieves what Jesus wants to do. The catalyst for that partnership being encapsulated is obedience. Not skills, not gifts, not intelligence, not wealth, nothing charismatic necessarily. It is simply obedience, because in obeying what Jesus asks, we do exactly what he has asked and nothing more. And at that point, Jesus says, we together can do the works of him who has sent us. You see, when we obey Jesus, we're not just doing something that we should because he is who he is. We're not doing something with the expectation that something will result from that we hadn't anticipated. But when we obey Jesus, we're actually giving ourselves the opportunity to partner with him and help him achieve his plans. Remarkable. Jesus, who has supreme authority, and a blind man who can't contribute anything, who can't even see where he's going, who can't even see Jesus. All he does is the only thing he can do, which is obey, and Jesus says, exactly what I wanted. Now, here's the surprise. Me and you together are going to achieve something that you will not anticipate. Really? What's that going to be? You're going to be able to see, wow, I can't do that. I can't do that. Well, you've already set it in motion because you are obeying me. And as a result of your obeying me, in the plan that I have devised, not that I need you to do it in order to heal you, I can do it on my own with a click of my fingers, but I want you to share the joy of partnering with me in achieving what I would like to do. Wow. That's the story. Obedience more important than anything else in this story, however wonderful anything else happens to be. Because of who he is, because of what he's done, we say, we want to obey you, Jesus. We want to follow you as best we can. We'll never be perfect. He doesn't ask us to be perfect. He just says, try to do your best. And I'll help you in the process. And I'll give you a little gift at the end from time to time when you're doing what you should be doing. But here's the big issue. When we obey Jesus this week in your office, in your home, in your university, in your college, on the streets, in your family, when you obey Jesus in whatever he asks you to do, you will be launching yourself up to another level of existence when you and Jesus, who happen to have created the universe all on his own, he says, together we will achieve something that will shock the socks off you because I'm involved. So I'm done. So let's just think about this for a moment. For those of us who are followers of Jesus, we may already be aware, because the Spirit has been nudging us in our thinking, we may be aware of some aspects in our lives that could do with another level of intensity of obedience, another movement and determination to put right what is not quite right, or to improve what needs to be improved, or to remove what needs to be removed from our characters. This is the time when we strategically decide that we're going to put into practice the song that we sang, Have Your Way, in our lives, and we are going to take the initiative and to do what this blind man did and obey. And if you are not a follower of Jesus and you're wondering how this relates to you, it relates exactly to you, because you may find yourself in a similar situation to this blind man. You're not quite too sure what life is all about. You can't see the purpose of it. You can't see the significance of you in the future. Coming to Jesus will make it possible for you to have a difference in your life that will be so brand new that you will be surprised. So I'm going to pray for you both groups, and ask that the Lord will take advantage of this story and embed it further into our psyche. Let me pray. Jesus, I'd like to thank you first for coming to this earth for the sole purpose of revealing to us who you are and who God is. Because in you we see God being manifested. And in this story, which is a wonderful story that results in this one man being healed remarkably, at the same time, we see other truths about who you are and the consequences for us. I thank you, Lord, that we don't need to see obedience as something slavish or burdensome or scary, but you're offering us the privilege of obeying you, who deserves to be obeyed because of who you are, but you add into that fresh ingredients that enable us to recognize that we, in obeying you, can serve you intimately for the benefit of others and to our own pleasure. Well, Lord, we've thought a little bit about how that might work out in our lives, those who are your followers, and I pray that you will embed some strategic suggestions deeply into our thinking that we will follow through this week and review them to make sure that we're putting into practice the lessons that we're learning. And for those of you who aren't followers of Jesus, I want to pray a little prayer. And if you would like to share this prayer with me, just quietly in your mind, I will pray it and give you time in your mind to repeat the words after me. And it's simply an acknowledgement that you want to be found by Jesus And as a result of that finding, to start a relationship with him that will be just like getting your sight back, because it'll be so wonderful. So just follow these words in your own mind as I pray this prayer on your behalf. Just say it quietly to yourself. Dear Lord Jesus, I come to you this morning recognizing a little bit about who you are and wanting to know you better. I would like to be your friend. More important, I'd like you to be my friend. So I'm reaching out to you and asking that you will reach out to me and absorb me into your friendship. Thank you that you do. Amen.